So good evening and welcome everybody to the City of Lakefront Park City Council workshop session for Thursday, October 9th. And I will call the meeting to order and I entertain a motion for adoption of the agenda.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. Any discussion? Not passed by unanimous consent. Thank you, everybody. We have two topics tonight, limited time. First of all, item A is Lakefront Park project update. Amber and Corey are here to share the successes that they've had with us. And welcome, Councilmember Good. Make sure, can you hear us okay?
Yes. Can you hear me?
You bet.
All right, awesome.
Yeah, and with that, I will hand it over to you folks.
Great. Here is our presentation. Just a couple things to go over today. So we'll advance to the next slide. So here's our agenda for the presentation. We'll look at the funding outlook, including our operation and maintenance cost estimate. And then we wanted to go into some of the precedent with building program. So the council has had some questions about the structures and some precedent and ideas. Corey's going to share some community support that we have for the flexible programming of those. We'll just step right in. And then the last thing will be just an update on the schedule and next steps. Not a lot of new news there, but we are moving ahead. So next slide. Biggest thing is our funding outlook. The city has successfully secured and identified grants to cover the anticipated cost of this project. So this is the full 12.93 million, which includes our project soft cost, anticipated construction cost, contingencies. Some of this is dollars paid to date. So for example, the city's investment in the design and permitting of the project that has already been paid, but that number is represented here. So in terms of our dollars, we have secured funds totaling 10 million and 10.4 million. The city has spent roughly 1.4 in terms of payments on design fees and other things, as well as staff time, etc. All of the additional dollars here are from grants through Washington RCO, the Recreation and Conservation Office, the Aquatic Lands Enhancement Fund. That was the last really piece of this, was some additional funding identified through that project. The King County Parks Capital Fund, as well as KC Parks levy appropriation, additional Senate budget allocation, and then some trails funding. So in a great place. The prospective funding is another $2.5 million, which we would be eligible for after the first of the year for the other another component of the trailhead. So the project contains two trailheads, a paddling trailhead and a surface land trailhead to connect to the Brook Gilman. Now that the levy has passed, that we know that funding is there, and so we will be making an application at the first of the year. So really positive outlook and picture here. Based on our cost estimate, we are looking at our low funding gap of none, and the potential high gap is $482. So we do anticipate that the project is completely funded, is likely to be completely funded at this point. So on the next slide, here's just a little bit more about the funding outlook. We are anticipating it to be fully funded. The confirmation of those funds is going to be anticipated in January 2026. So in January, we should know if we have that last $2.5 million. We do have some options for backup funding. We don't have all of those dollars yet. Everything but that $2.5 million is secured. So we can apply for another RCO application. We're in a really good position to leverage the funds that the city already has to match things to close the gap if something happens with the $2.5 million and we don't receive it. That funding application is May 1st, 2026. You guys remember when we did May 1st, 2024. This is the next time that it's open. If we think that that's going to be necessary, we should definitely target that application because the next time that it will open again is 2028. So we also have opportunities for community fundraising. This is something that we have always talked about. So sponsorship of elements in the design, programmatic elements such as tree planting, bench sponsorships, paying for pavers in the park, those types of things. If we don't need those to build the project, those funds can still be a program that the city uses to cover operations and maintenance costs. So we'll be exploring more of that after the permits are approved and we get to 100% design, and then we'll detail in those elements if that's something the city would like to pursue. So more on that later. Okay, does anybody have any questions on the side, or should I just keep rolling?
Topics, questions, comments? That's where they go.
May we get a full project budget and showing how the funding works that represents the total project?
Sure, I think we could. Have to get the city administration file. Administrator. A couple of just quick thoughts, colleagues, other comments first. Jackie or for Tony.
So thanks for the presentation. And so my understanding then is that the city for the construction phase could literally be on the hook for nothing.
Well, I mean, in the sense that you would have received grant dollars, but then you would pay for the project
Right.
construction, but yes, it would be fully deferred by grants, yes.
Wow. Okay, thank
Yeah,
you.
yes.
Did you have a? Vice Chair Bolden.
Yeah, thanks. So you had mentioned that you're optimistic about that final 2.5 million from the trailhead program. Historically, how competitive has that grant application tended to be?
Without speaking out of turn, I would say not tremendously competitive.
I think it's very focused on what it can go for. So we have 2 trailheads that gives us a eligible and.
Right, I don't want to say that it's not competitive for projects, but the eligibility criteria to meet it tends to be high. And so once you meet the eligibility criteria, there is a lot of advocacy from the county to help you, qualify for those funds. Yeah, they are looking for projects typically.
Sounds good.
Alex, other comments or questions? Just one quick comment on the, sponsorship, et cetera. We met, Administrator Flo and I met with an individual from the city or from the community today who was interested in, who was concerned about a couple trees on the property. And he said, I will sponsor them and buy them if necessary. It's another thing for us to think about, that if there is a situation where there's trees that might be endangered, somebody could make a modest contribution to protect those trees, to change the design. I thought that was really insightful of him to suggest it. And actually, I don't think those trees are in jeopardy, so we're okay, but we will definitely keep him in mind when it comes to funding. Colleagues, any other questions? Okay, please continue.
Great, okay. So our operations and maintenance estimate. So I do want to actually just mention about the funding outlook. So that's all based on the detailed funding picture that we did of the 70% plans. So the cost estimate on which this funding projection is based on the 70% design. We will re-cost the project at 100% design after the permits are done. And again, that scope of contingency, where right now we're applying these larger contingencies to the early design phases, those narrow, but we still have contingencies in the project budget. When we get to 100%, those will further reduce. So we anticipate a cost margin to be more focused, but as they have been thus far in the project, still in the range of what we have been forecasting. So our operations and maintenance cost estimate. So this is based on the communication with the council previously, it is a focused cost estimate for the immediate first 5 years after the park opens. And then there are incremental costs for planning expenses on the 10, 15, 20, and 25-year budget. So a few things about this cost estimate. This is a cost projection, theoretical, based on other sites like this. So for example, the city already owns and maintains the preserve. Those costs are still captured in this number because the preserve will be 1/3 of this project going forward. The city does own the Turner property, was that writing? I think so. So the city owns the 2 newly acquired parcels. There has been maintenance that has happened there previous to this project, mowing, utility payments, those types of things. When the garage door needed to be patched, that was something that was repaired. Those costs would all be included in this number as well. So this is a cost that reflects the proposed project condition. So we anticipate things like public bathroom cleaning, currently not something that you're doing out on that site. That would be a new cost, but this would not necessarily be representative of a fully new expense because it would be offset by anything that the city is already spending in its maintenance of the preserve and in its operation and maintenance of the preserve and of the 2 properties, which have not previously been open to the public. Yes.
Do you know how much of that is represented? Like we talked to.
I don't know exactly. Okay. Yeah, so this is based on a square footage cost, so we could break that down further. To say, the square footage of the preserve is roughly 1/3 of the property, so we might say 1/3 of some of these values that are calculated on a square footage basis. Would be represented by the preserve. This is also based on what the cost estimator consultant has for comparative properties. It would represent the average standard of maintenance for a property like this, but ultimately the city's standard of maintenance is what the costs should be based on. So this came from our cost estimation consultant, but it really should be reviewed by the city's in-house crew to see where this is hitting in terms of what the preserve already costs. Remember, the preserve has more trails now than it will have post-project construction. So we may actually see maintenance costs shift from the preserve to the larger park. So there could be some offset of values there, but it'd be wonderful to have their input.
Question,
Yes.
have you had any feedback on the new dock and like what its maintenance sort of cadence would be? As far as,
Not specifically. We can look at other similar facilities and ask park systems, what is included in that. Otherwise, this is represented in the cost estimator's number in terms of, what they're looking at. So a few things about the planned long-term maintenance forecast. So there's items in here like fixture replacement, appliance replacement. These are based on, just typical estimates of like a routine commercial kitchen when you may be replacing the appliances. This does not mean that in year 10, you have to replace the appliances. Your appliances may still be in good shape. The thing that this is recommending is that in order to have adequate reserve to replace those, should they break in year 10, it would recommend that you have this amount saved for those and other planned expenses. Same things with things like the.
I apologize. Let me interrupt you.
Sure, go ahead.
Councilmember Good, you've been waiting patiently. Sorry, I was trying to look at the numbers here.
Oh, okay, thank you. Does this estimate include operating the part of the park as a civic area? And does it include insurances and things like that? And
For the-
people to operate and people to operate the civic part of the, not just the land itself, but if you're holding events there, does it include things like that?
So it does not include the insurance, or, event licenses or insurance riders. The city may, be obligated to, or may make their event renters obligated to provide. We did talk about with the council, whether or not you wanted us to look at revenue generation as a theoretical, addition to this to offset some of these maintenance costs. And based on the fact that the program of those spaces is not fully determined, rental rates have not been set. It would need basically a occupancy survey to find out what the market is like for rentals of these spaces. Just based on kind of cursory research of similar spaces in places like Seattle, et cetera. In Seattle, if you rent a picnic shelter for a birthday, a half day, it can be in the $300-400 range. I don't know if that is what that would be Lake Forest Park's plan for rental rates on things like the picnic shelter. There are also other similar jurisdictions where you can reserve a picnic shelter at no cost. So some of these are really highly variable operational decisions that the city will have to make. And so because it's difficult to get to an accurate forecast of some of those things, being that those decisions are not made on the city side, we did not include any revenue generation expenses in this picture. So you can expect that if the park is operated to gain revenue, then those may offset some of the cost of operating them in that way, or they may offset some of the costs shown here. But it did seem to be viewed as extra, and what could best provide you as a tool for decision making would be what the potential obligatory cost would be to maintain the space. That makes sense.
Would that also apply? I'm sorry, just one more thing. Would that also apply to insurance? The annual insurance for the property?
So we,
When you have a facility like that, you need to maintain some sort of.
Council members, he's off screen, but
Sorry, I'm off screen. I'll lean up just so you can hear me. So we already have this property insured by WCIA. It was insured at the full amount for the existing structures, property at the time that we also had a renter on board. And so we will get back with WCIA once the project is nearing Well, once we have full design, so they understand what structures will be on there, and the insurance will pivot to cover those going forward. They didn't have any concerns when we purchased this about liability of the waterfront. It will be a discussion at the future date of, you know, is this a signs that say, you know, you're on your own, no lifeguard on duty, that's a for the later date.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Ashley, Councilman McCartney.
So looking at what some of these, what's included and not, as first off, is there any element for security and policing and just maintaining, but in the maintenance costs or anything about that?
That's a great question. I don't know if there is a on-site security included in this, because it's not in the notes, so I can ask about that.
Okay, I think that's.
My assumption would be no, since it is not written in the assumptions.
Currently, it's on heavy rotation with the police department. Make sure that nobody's getting in through the, you know, breaking through the fencing or going through the side or around the other side. We've had one or two incidences in the last 2.5 years, I think. So this would.
Oh, and can I,
Go ahead and follow up.
the last piece was, can you explain again why the utilities are not included? Utility costs, is that because the design isn't 100%, so you don't know if we have 12 toilets versus 11, or?
No, it's actually because of just the variability of that. So we don't know how often the toilets will be flushed, which is, you know, what the water use would be. We also don't know how often the community center will be rented. So are the lights on operational all the time? Are they not operational all the time? Is the annex going to be used for, you know, a groundskeeper or a community policing office where it will be on and used all the time? So again, there's a little bit of concern there. There's also, we still have the question of irrigation, whether there's going to be an automated irrigation system, which will obviously have a cost associated with the project, which will influence greatly the utility cost. So this is a great, one of those wonderful things that would have, if we could have some input from the landscape crew and the parks maintenance crew currently that maintain similar facilities, and what are the likely utility costs that they are seeing in similarly operated facilities.
And just noted, we don't have a public restroom in any of our parks, so this is a new cost for us, so.
Councilman Rizzo.
It would be helpful if the city could develop a total cost range for what it sees as the operation and maintenance would include insurance, security. I assume you're gonna, even if you don't have permanent irrigation, you'll have temporary irrigation for plant establishment.
Yes.
Some way to make it, so there would be a cost for running that. But if also for staffing, so how are we going to staff it in terms of, is there a person there or is there a part-time person with the city? So it'd be helpful to understand what we, if we complete this, what is the incremental cost the city will now have to pay that we don't have in our current budget? Because it's going to be a lot more than what's stated here, particularly depending upon how much you have to have it staffed. So I'm concerned that we don't have this budgeted and yet we're moving forward with it. We don't have a plan for how we're going to fund it.
We're still a couple years away, and income from rentals that we do get could be put back into staffing this for events for staff.
That's fine, but your plan would say, we think we can rent it 50 days a year and we get $500 per rental, and that then translates to $1, but it would be useful to have, okay, what is our plan? So that we can establish what is our funding mechanism to represent those costs for which we don't have a budget today. And you can make all kinds of assumptions, and so you get a range of costs. Our annual operating costs might be $300,000 to $400,000 a year, depending on how many times somebody flushes the toilet.
Colleagues, other questions? I have a quick question on a point about water irrigation. Property came with water rights in a well. Are we banning that, or?
So we could not find any documentation of
Okay.
a water right. We know that a well is on the property.
Yeah.
And that water was used from it. However,
Okay.
it is not present in ecology or other records that says that is a legal
I
record.
kind of assumed that, but I was
We-
certain.
Looked as hard as we could. If you have any, or the city has any documentation of that from the purchase, which we asked for previously, but if it shows up, we'd love that. That's my first the whole site flows to the lake, and so in terms of this being irrigation for native species, it's a great way to use the source, but
Sure.
as it is now, I think we.
Yeah, this
We
goes
have-
right back to where it's go, where. it started.
Totally, yeah, the plan is to decommission that well.
Yeah, fair enough. Thank you. Vice Chair Goldman.
Yeah, so hypothetically, if down the line, the city council decided to allow some sort of concession stand in the park. Would revenue from that, is that something that could help to defray some of these operational costs?
Yeah, the city would have the, ability to, all of the spaces are designed to be flexible. And so really is the city's decision making in terms of how the facilities are operated moving forward, in terms of how the revenue generation will happen. And then what those dollars would be used for. So that would be an internal city decision within the park's operating plan. But based on what we're providing, and we'll share some of the precedent images from the park that would be possible.
Probably should move on from this. We're gonna run out of time. We have one more topic. Please continue.
Great. Go to the next picture. So we've had some questions about the building program. How will these be used? What is the purpose of them? So in our engagement with the community and in the long range documents that the city had, it's pros plan and others. The city, the community has been asking for flexible spaces that can respond to community needs as the community grows and changes. And so we took that to heart. We heard things like artist residency, scout meetings, master gardener meetings, retreat rentals. So what is a facility that allows all of those things? As the needs pop up in the community, the city can host them here. We had a lot of community meetings for this project. We had a lot of direct stakeholder meetings, small group discussion meetings. All of those happened in various rooms in City Hall. They could happen in a facility like this. So again, the goal was to provide flexibility for the city to use it as it needed. That also helps the facility from getting, too tightly programmed and then becoming not usable and irrelevant as needs change. So this is the picture of the community center. We'll go skip forward. Looks like there's a hand raised.
Oh, Councilmember Good.
You're on mute.
Oh, yes. Do we have a capacity, a maximum capacity for the building? Because
Yes.
that might help in determining what you can use it for.
Sure. So the capacity of the building we have been looking at as array of different basically floor plans. So there is a standing room capacity, there is an estimated seated room capacity. So based on the post occupancy of the structures, the maximum capacity is 159. So that is a standing room configuration. Once you introduce tables there, that you would really overwhelm the space. So the architect has sized basically we're working with the set footprint of the building. We can't expand out of it. If we can fit 159 people in there, what does it look like with tables? How many tables fit? And then sizing the interior storage closet to hold that many tables and that many chairs. So those furnishings are included as part of the project budget. They have been, so the architect is specifying those furniture and furnishings. And there is a room built inside of the community center that holds those furnishings. So it's all sized together. So, you will be getting a ready to use facility that is equipped with those items. So as you can see here, so this is showing the seating configuration. It is a flexible space. You can imagine numerous different things happening in here. The tables I think that are proposed can be set up in I think they are rounds, and then they also have another floor plan that shows more of like a presentation type arrangement of the chairs. So there's more chairs than at the tables. But anyway, the architect has that handled. So the goal is flexibility.
And
Okay.
will that also include the storage of the chairs and the table? Because I know that when you get a permit, the building department, sometimes they determine the maximum capacity of a building. Even though technically it could hold more people, the building will be permitted for a certain size. And then I see these chairs are pretty fixed in their size. And so is there a plan for storage areas of the furniture?
Yes, there's a storage closet inside the building, and it is sized to hold this furniture. So all of those decisions are being made together. So next slide. So these are based on a kind of a poll of other similar facilities in similar jurisdictions. This is a range of the things that we have heard from them in terms of what is provided in their flexible community facilities and buildings. I think Corey's going to talk about some of the groups that we've heard from.
Yeah, and
you know, when we first started this, we had over 20 support letters from neighboring city, the county, and our community partners. There's gonna be a filled schedule for this, but for this center. So Scouts, Stewardship Foundation, Rotary, Shore Lake Arts, Senior Center, they've all shown interest in wanting to use space, and we will support that.
Okay. So the next slide shows an image of the annex building. So this is what was previously called cabin 6. So this is a small building. We have talked about a number of different uses here. If you skip forward to the next image, you can see a interior where this is shown as office space. If this building is engineered as office space, it can be used as office space. So it is a different structural loading of the building, which then limits the flexibility that the city has to program it for other things. In our working on the structural proposal, we actually determined that because the pilings were not needed to reinforce the foundation, because we're able to replace the building entirely with a mat slab foundation, that left a little bit of dollars still within the construction of the annex building that we use to increase the structural engineering of the floor to a gathering capacity. So this provides the city with more flexibility at the same cost to be able to use this building for other uses. So for example, you may have a large gathering in the community center and a smaller gathering space here. But again, these are things where essentially the park will be provided as the park is provided to the city to use, and then operationally over the next many generations that the city operates this park, it will have the flexibility to operate these buildings as it wishes. Okay, the next slide shows a list for similar size facilities. So some of these are repeated from the previous but it is a shorter list, it's a smaller building. So again, handful of things we do anticipate based on Corey's communication with the city and based on the things that we heard in the community engagement, that there is demand for flexible use facilities for rentals here. So on the next slide, we have some precedent examples. So these are spaces that you can go see, you can look up, I can provide some more information on. They're a mix of local and then spaces away, but there are lots in our area, many not listed here. So the Brightwater Center is one that is a King County operated facility. It has a very interesting modern design, but then the interior again is flexible space, tables, chairs, movable walls, open gallery space, lots of windows, similar elements to what we'll have here. The next slide shows Bird Bar Place in Seattle. So this is rented out for community events. It's in a historic building, much like this structure is. Again, with the ability to have open floor plans or to equip it with furniture. The next slide shows the Peter Kirk Community Center in Kirkland. So this is one where they have a range of rooms that you can use for different purposes. Again, open seating, presentations, small rentals. Just about every library in the King County library system also has a range of rooms that you can rent for different purposes that are incredibly handy. And then the next one is a building called the Foundry. This is another example of a historic brick structure with flexible room space. This one is in Cambridge. So the next building that we have shown is the Picnic Pavilion. So the Picnic Pavilion is a picnic pavilion, lots of precedent in the area, but number of things that in talking to other similar, go to the next slide. In terms of talking to other similar land managers that operate picnic pavilions, these are some of the things that we heard from them that were common uses of the picnic pavilion structures. And then going through the next few slides, we have some precedent examples of similar facilities on Vashon and in Woodinville, where you have similar elements to what the proposed picnic pavilion will have. So any questions on those? The last slide is just a recap of our schedule. Like I said, are any questions about program?
I continue to be concerned about the location with regard to safety and parking. So what is the plan for how we're going to manage parking so that this becomes a successful facility? Because it has 2 accessible parking stalls plus service for loading. But I can't imagine we're gonna park on Beach Drive. There's no turnaround, and I would imagine that there could be parking restrictions. So I'm concerned about the functionality of this at this location. And the safety of people crossing from wherever they park or trying to park at the Zip Pub, which will go over one. So what is the plan to say that this will in fact be functional because it has no parking? So in any of these visions, did any of these not have? Are there any examples that don't have adjacent parking that demonstrate that they're successful?
The urban examples are the best ones, where there's limited on-street, but it's on-street that's shared. So like the Bird Bar space in downtown Seattle is a great example of where it doesn't have, you know, a large capacity of dedicated parking. I don't know if that has any dedicated parking, but I don't want to say that it doesn't because I have not personally verified that. But that's a great example. So in an urban area, you would have lots of transit connectivity, lots of walkable connectivity. Lake Forest Park isn't urban, but we do have the benefit of a transit-oriented place where we've got, you know, the coming BRT connection. We have the existing King County bus stops. We do have the functional crossing across the street. There is the talk about potentially a pedestrian bypass over 522, and then the Burt Gilman Trail is there as well. The parking capacity, the buildings actually hold many more than the post occupancy will be. But because of how that changes the demand for parking, the post occupancy is lowered so that way it's supported by the parking study that was provided earlier on in the project. If that makes sense. So
It doesn't make sense. There's no on-street, there's no on-site parking, you know, adjacent parking is in the town center.
So in the proposed design, there is a total of 10 parking spaces that are at the site. There are 3 that are accessible, that are marked accessible. And then there's the discussion of the rest of them being load or unload. What we have talked about is that those could be operationally limited through things like a parking permit. If you rent the facility, you may get a parking permit. But again, that would be an operational concern.
There is a dedicated safe walking from the city hall parking lot to the civic club right now.
Colleagues, other questions on the point? We're going to move on to just a second. Second agenda item. Questions on schedule?
We are working, we've submitted for our permit and gotten an initial response with some questions. So we've submitted those responses and we are now waiting for the staff report to the determination being the next things that we're looking forward to. Next in the schedule will be scheduling for the hearing examiner. In the meantime, we are working on some of the placemaking interpretation design with the Parks and Rec Board. And then we're looking at after the hearing examiner's decision, we'll be moving the plans to 100% completion and then towards bid. So that is where we are at currently.
Any other questions? Thank you very much for presentation. We really appreciate it. It's really encouraging to hear that the city is going to be putting out a very small amount of money in the aggregate for this project. It's a testament to everybody's work on grant funding, and we'll continue to do that on all our projects. So, Councilmember Good, did you have any final questions before we move on? Okay, just want to check with you and miss you there. Thank you. Okay, with that, thank you very much, you two. And with that, we're going to move on to Director Hoffman. We're Sustainable Forestry Initiative, the SFI Urban Forest and Community Forest Sustainability Grant for Forest Planning. We've been talking about this for some time.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah. I don't know what to call this. It's an update. Well, it's simply touched. I know that the tree board chair, Mark Phillips, was at council, gave an introduction. What's missing from this meeting and that meeting are the actual grant agreement. So I'm open to any questions, but the update we intend to provide is we intend to pursue this grant. As you know, the issue was brought up very early this year. Urban Forest Planner, hey, there's a grant available, let's pursue it. The amount was $25,000. It's quickly determined that with monthly, quarterly, and annual federal reporting, that wasn't going to get us anything. We didn't need to be certified. What we need is an update in our forest management plan. And with Drew talking to Sustainable Forestry Initiative staff, that amount went up considerably. Still not 100,000, but 70 plus, it becomes beneficial. And then right after we got to that point, she took a different employment. She had the capability to pull this off, do a majority of it, manage it, and make it happen for the dollar amount we're seeking. We quickly pivoted and recruited a new urban forest planner. He's been here, I think, 4 weeks. I think this is his 4th week. He's aware of this. We talked about Tuesday. This will be his task. If this becomes my task, something major will not get done. So that's how I view this. It's beneficial, we could pursue it. Mike Martini at SFI is very helpful. He's very accommodating, very flexible. The money comes from US Department of Agriculture, the Forest Service, to SFI.
Okay,
SFI has the ability to be very flexible. As of right now, they are not subject to the federal shutdown. So we are amending an agreement with the scope of work with Mike Martini to proceed. Before the city attorney went on vacation, she did a thorough review. We added a week to that for her to review the prime agreement between USDA and SFI. She provided comments. I sat with Mike Martini and went through all of them. The one that's not completed is the detailed scope of work. We have an intent, we have a description, we know what the effort is, we have the support, and we know we want to do it. The flexibility allows us to not go towards certification, which is the main point of this effort. But with Mike's help, we can come up with a scope that consists of steps that begin or help us with our forest management plan update and get us started. The audit, for instance, what's missing. The scope does not need to include money for certification. They're fine with that. So in his helping in October with the scope, we've had a few stumbling points, and last week we dusted it off. Tuesday we dusted it off. For a variety of reasons, we don't have it. Tree board didn't have a quorum. They are likely to meet on the 15th. Our goal tomorrow is to get a draft scope. We have to work on it Monday and Tuesday. If we get it detailed enough, we will. And then our intent is to bring it Wednesday night for blessing and tree board. That would fulfill the comments on the review. I would sit with SFI. They will produce the final copy. Then we are ready for a city council agenda. So I think the support's there. This is second. Touch or not. There is no time issue right now, right? The grant funding runs through next year. There's plenty of time to do this. They suggested at the beginning of September and August, give us a letter of interest. Show us your interest in pursuing this. We'll keep you on our list. We did that. They have that. As we go into November, it starts to become an issue again. So we're working against it. If we get council approval in November, then we're on track. We just start to look.
just a quick,
Yep.
I'm sorry, please, Mark, so continue. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just was gonna remind the council that we've had situations in the past, particularly on federal grants, under about $100,000. The reporting requirements are so onerous that it's actually costs us money to do the reporting, to apply and do the reporting. It's more expensive than it's worth. I'm not suggesting that's the case here, but we want to make sure that the benefit outweighs the expenditure on the back end, so to speak, front end, excuse me.
The primary impact will be on CD department. The way that the scope and budget is written is that a small portion would compensate for staff time, Sam's time.
Okay.
Majority would go to a consultant. The reason the scope's important is if we don't have a detailed scope of work with steps or tasks, the flexibility from SFI will get us into trouble. Mike is very helpful, but when I bring the agreement to council, we have a project description and intent, but what are the steps to get the contract? And it's not USDA. So if we go forward as written, we would then not RFQ, but talk with a variety of consultants to see who's most qualified. What is it that we're asking them to do? That's why the scope is very important right now. Worst case, a year from now, if we perform all that work, expend $77-something thousand and Mike's flexibility is gone or he's gone, the situation changes, we will not get reimbursed. So the detail on the scope is current step. So we're working on that.
Meister Goldman, did you want to chime in?
No, I think Director Hoffman summed it up pretty well. I know the tree board is very excited about this.
Sure.
They did want to meet, a number of members had personal matters that knocked them out for last week. So the hope is to reconvene them for next Wednesday.
Great. Yeah. That's what we're doing.
I know at one point we were considering becoming an evergreen community. Would this update to the forest management plan support that effort?
I don't think it's needed. My next email to Sam on his next task is that very effort. I have an email from their representative this week asking for an update on contacts. I intend to use that as an introduction of hear sound and then pursue and continue with that program. I don't think they're directly related, other than they both very much support trees.
I don't remember if they have sort of what their requirements are for a forest management plan that could also help maybe with a scope of work kind of piece if they've got, it was just a thought.
Parts of it will, because our intent is to spend the grant funds to get us closer into an update of the forest management plan, which directly relates to it.
Okay.
But there will be another round to finish the update. But meanwhile, pursue that program as well. That is not stopping. It's just a newness of the position and sure we have to help with. So given that timeline, my hope is that when we resolve all the legal comment issues and get an agreement that we can put in the packet, I can show you the nuances and scope of the budget at a council meeting and ask for adoption.
That's what we're doing.
So, Mayor French, you made a very good comment about sort of what are the city costs. So will that count as part of the package to say, if we accept this grant, here are the costs that we're going to incur to administer or implement the grant? And here's the funding source for that.
Yes, we have that right now. Generally about 24,000. The original grant request is to compensate for staff time. I cannot ask the new staff person, can you perform that with your skills and expertise until I know exactly what that is, and that's why the scope's holding up. The remaining 40 something will compensate the consultant work to identify that. I know from past discussions that primary work is the audit. Consultant reads the plan according to the checklist and identifies what's missing or what's weak or kind of strength opportunities. It's the other steps that we need. I also have assurance that the monthly reporting is minimal. It's an email.
Oh, good.
It's the quarterly and annual that may affect other departments, and it is a federal funds. So we're putting a careful lens on what the agreement consists of.
And I do want to say, couching what I said earlier, that most of the time the grants are worthwhile to pursue if there's a real vested interest in do that. It's just, it comes down to the accounting and reporting requirements that can be onerous, particularly at the federal level. And this is not to pour cold water on this one, because I think it's a very positive step. We've had in the past, as you know, we've returned a grant or rejected a grant. I think it's $90,000 for something that the reporting was going to cost us a couple $100,000 to staff. It's staggering. So balancing those things is very important going into it eyes open. So, and it's also yeah, I mean, we've got to keep casting our net wide and far to try to get as much grant as we possibly can. Councilmember Good, did you have any questions? I want to make sure I don't miss you. Okay. Colleagues. Warren, Chief. Good. He's good. Okay. Thank you, Director Hoffman. And we look forward to updates, and thank you, Vice Chair Goldman, about the updates about the board. And we know that everybody has busy, so totally respect their time and value their time very deeply. I think that's where we are. I'm looking at the time here. It's actually probably a good time for, if there's nothing else from the group, for us to adjourn. You can grab a cup of water, and we'll see you upstairs. Good luck in the transporter, Paula. We'll see you on the other side. We're adjourned.